Hey everyone, today on Big Out Books, I'm going to be doing my May wrap-up. So I feel like I say this every month, but I do have a weird stack of books to talk about. That just seems to be a reoccurring pattern. But in today's video, we're going to cover some Shakespearean plays. We're going to talk about some romance novels, which is really out of my comfort zone, but that's what ended up happening this month. I've got some excellent new releases to talk about. And lastly, we're going to get to a book about Norwegian death metal. So it is going to be quite the wrap up. Let's get into it. The first book I read this month was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, the famous classic that I have been avoiding reading for a very long time. I made a discussion video, which I'll link down below, where I talked more about why I was put off from reading Jane Austen and how I had these feelings of pride and or prejudice before going into this book. But essentially, I'm glad that I overcame these ridiculous feelings because I did enjoy myself reading this charming book. It was quite delightful. I will have to say that the second half definitely dragged for me, but that just might be because of what was going on in my busy personal life. I initially picked up this book because my sister wanted to read it, and I thought it would be nice to read it together, but she actually read it way quicker than I did. It took me a really long time to get through the second half of this book, to the point where it just felt frustrating, where I just felt like I was making no progress and this novel was never gonna end. That being said, I'm still really glad that I gave this work a try. I'm glad that I've broken the ice with Jane Austen because I think I will definitely continue on to check out more of her books in the future. The next book that I read is kind of the polar opposite of Pride and Prejudice. That was Vernon, Subutex 1 by Virginie Despentes. I didn't know much about this author, but I'm going to try to find you her picture that is in this book because it is wild. She looks like a tough chick. And this is one of the books that was on the shortlist for the Man Booker International Prize. This is a book set in Paris about a man whose record store had to close down because people don't really buy music anymore, and it's kind of about his steady decline, where he all of a sudden can't afford to pay his rent anymore, so he has to start couch surfing between various friends, and then he eventually ends up on the streets. So it's kind of a tale about a pretty broken guy at a rough time in his life, and what I liked about this is that it's about the really scuzzy and seedy side of Paris. So, like, you know, over here, we just hear so many, like, nostalgic, wonderful things about Paris and how it's, like, this romantic, beautiful place, but this is a really different side of Paris that is much less glorified, which I thought was really interesting to read about. This book does frequently shift narrative perspective. You basically are introduced to a new narrator each chapter, so if there is a person that you find particularly offensive and intolerable, then at least you're not stuck with that person for too long before you move on to someone else. I did find that this technique got a bit tiring by the end of the book, but it's still neat to get this wide range of perspectives, so I will say I enjoyed this book for the most part. I especially enjoy books that have lots of music references, and this had a lot of wonderful, obscure music references. It made me so happy. Like, she mentioned Ty Segall in this book, so that just warmed my heart. This is the kind of book where if there's a casual comment made about the kind of music a character likes, it is often an insight into their personality, which I enjoy kind of piecing together those kind of clues. So I did enjoy the vibe of this novel. I liked the kind of scuzzy ambiance and the questionable people in this book. So while it wasn't a perfect novel for me, I did enjoy reading it, and I will probably continue on with this series when there are more books released in English. The next book that I have to talk about is one of my favorite reads of the year so far. This is The Understory by Richard Powers. I'd never heard of Richard Powers before, but on the back of this book, he was compared to David Foster Wallace, Jonathan Franzen, and William Vollmann. So those are all authors that I've enjoyed before in the past, so I was excited to give this a go. All I knew about this book is that it was going to be about trees, and that was all I needed to know. Like, I was in the mood for this, and man, this book absolutely blew me away. It made me see trees in such a new and different perspective, and I already thought that I was a tree hugger. You know, I already thought that I loved trees, but this book gave me so many new things to think about, like how when you're looking at a tree, you're only seeing half of the picture, right? We can only see the piece that's above ground, while underneath there's this whole community connected by roots, how trees communicate with each other and and their environment, how they're probably trying to communicate with us. This book has a great, compelling cast of characters. We're all introduced to them as individuals. We learn their life story and how trees tend to play a very significant role in their lives. And then they do eventually find their way to meet with each other as they become tree activists, and the book really rolls from there. So this was a book that I just could not put down. Luckily, I was able to read it over a long weekend, so I could just binge read it. But really, after I finished this book, it was so emotional and beautiful, and I just wanted to be outside in nature. So it really gave me an appreciation for the natural world around us. But it was also such a well-crafted piece of fiction that I just can't recommend this book highly enough. I truly loved it, and I hope to expand on more of my thoughts and further this conversation in a review to come later. The Overstory was one of those books that was just so emotional and intense, and I just needed something a little bit lighter after reading a book like that. So I decided to pick up a slim novella called Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville. That's right, this is Herman Melville, author of the notorious whaling classic Moby Dick. That is a book that I know that I'm going to have to read at some point, but I'm just not ready to go there yet. So this was my first kind of dipping my toe into the world of Herman Melville, and I really enjoyed this slim and strange novella. This is about a lawyer who works on Wall Street in the 19th century, and he hires a scrivener, basically someone who just copies out legal documents by hand, named Bartleby, and one day Bartleby just kind of up and decides that he doesn't want to do work anymore. So when his boss asks him to do something, he just politely says, "I would prefer not to." So this is just such like a relatable story. If you're someone who's a little stressed out by life, there's something so beautiful in this passive act of resistance, right? Just telling the man no, you know, I would prefer not to. And Bartleby never really gives a reason why. He's not very hostile or aggressive about it. He would just prefer not to. And the boss, it kind of gets to this point where, okay, I can't really have this guy working for me anymore because he won't do anything for me, but I also can't kick him out of my office. So it becomes a bit of this dilemma. So this is just such like a strange little story. I loved this thing. I'm not quite ready for Moby Dick yet, but I'm glad that I gave Melville a try. The next book that I read this month is It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. This is a romance novel that is way out of my comfort zone. I do not usually pick up books like this, but I had a few students in one of my English classes recommend this book to me, so I thought I wanted to pick it up before the semester ended so that we could chat about this book. And it was an interesting experience, as I have not read like a proper romance novel in a really long time, so it was very strange, but I'm glad that I broadened my horizons and tried something different. Apparently this book is in the NA genre, and apparently that doesn't stand for Narcotics Anonymous, but it actually stands for New Adult Literature. So it's kind of like YA+. It is meant for the 18 to 25 demographic, so technically I'm still in that demo at the tail end, but I don't really think that this was a book that I exactly identified with or necessarily enjoyed. I personally find romance books to be really awkward because I don't like watching people flirt with each other, and the male interest in this book was just way too much for me. He is like a genius brain surgeon, and he's super rich, and he's also smoking hot, so like it was just like people like this don't exist, you know? It was just too much for me. But I will say that there is quite a bit of depth contained in this novel since it does deal with the topic of domestic abuse. The main character in this book grows up in a household where her father was abusive towards her mother, so she grows up so bitter. She thinks that she's going to learn from her environment and find someone completely different. So when her dream boyfriend starts being a bit abusive, she doesn't really know how to deal with the situation, and it just makes you realize how complicated relationships can be. And the book talks a lot about how people on the outside of the relationship will often judge the woman in the abusive relationship, and you know, we ask, why did she go back to him? Why doesn't she leave him? Why is she putting up with this? And this book just makes you realize how complicated it is when it's the person that you love the most that is causing you harm, and you really don't want to believe that that's what's happening. So it was a pretty sensitive portrayal of a really difficult dilemma. I can't say that this is a genre that I hope to return to anytime soon, but I'm glad that I checked this out and I did enjoy discussing it with my students. Speaking of my students, I got to read Romeo and Juliet again this year. I feel like this book just keeps coming up on my channel. This is the second time this school year that I've taught this play, and man, it was a really different experience this time around. My class absolutely hated Romeo's character. They thought that he was really dumb and impulsive and irresponsible, which is kind of true, but they just ganged up on Romeo so hard that I kept trying to find redeeming points to his personality because they're just so hard on him. I found that this class is very intellectual, so they just got so frustrated when characters don't use reason and logic, but I feel like half of the story here is the emotion and the stupidity of young teenage love. So it was a really fun class to read this play with, and I'm glad that I got to check it out another time, even though I'm currently working my way through a stack of essays, so I'm kind of feeling like I never want to read this again in my life, but I'm sure it will keep popping up. The other Shakespearean play I read this month was The Tempest. This was also a reread for me, but I was going to see my first live production of the play, and I always like brushing up before I go to the theater, and this is a really weird play, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I don't think that I really like it all that much. Everything seems very low stakes. Like, this theoretically should be so intense, you know, this revenge play set on this like intense tropical island, but ultimately the plot just never builds up or gets resolved in an exciting manner. So I can't say that I love this one, although there's definitely enough like weirdness in it to keep me interested. I absolutely loved the character of Caliban, and in the production that I saw, he was like this like half reptile creature that was doing all these cool crouching moves on the stage, so I definitely liked that. I kind of like the meta commentary on theater that Shakespeare's throwing down, but yeah, for the most part, this is not really my favorite play, but I was still glad that I got to see it live because it was pretty cool. There's lots of like music and special effects because of the storm in this play, even though the production that I saw went pretty overkill on the special effects, but still, this play doesn't really transfer that well on the page. It's definitely better to see it live, so glad that I got to cross this one off my Shakespearean list. My nonfiction read of the month was a weird one. It was Lords of Chaos, The Bloody Rise of the Satanic Metal Underground by Michael Moynihan and Didrik Soderlind. So this was a book that I casually encountered at my local bookstore, and I just could not pass this up, right? Like, it is about Norwegian death metal and how strange the scene was. And I thought it was kind of funny because this book is supposed to go beyond the sensationalism that is portrayed in the tabloids about these like devil-worshipping teens that were going around burning churches in Norway, and the book is supposed to kind of pull that back and give you a deeper understanding of what was happening, but yet this book has such a sensationalistic cover, and the back is just full of the most outrageous quotes. Like, here are a few of the first quotes from the back cover. "I don't want to see people respecting me. I want them to hate and fear," said by Euronymous of Mayhem. "He died from one stab to the head. Through his skull. I actually had to knock the knife out. Varg Vikernes, after killing former friend Euronymous." So, as you can see, the back just makes this book seem like this crazy drama, like these characters are all friends and then they're murdering each other and not feeling remorseful about this. Like, what is going on? The saga of Norwegian death metal is truly bizarre, so it was interesting to learn about what exactly was going on, why this movement took off, what were some of its influences. I will say that there was not enough content for this book to justify being around 400 pages in length. Really, the stuff that they talk about on the back cover is the most exciting stuff. So once you get through that story, not as much intense stuff happens, but it's still a pretty interesting read. You learn about how these bands were not necessarily interested in Satan as much as they were in shock value, and how a lot of them were interested in Norse mythology and bringing back that kind of pagan culture. So burning of the churches is actually showing a sign of loyalty to their pagan ancestors, but also how that interest in Norse mythology leads a lot of these people to become kind of racist and connected to right-wing movements and kind of Nazi fascist ideologies. So the book does discuss a lot of these movements in greater detail. It just kind of got tedious after a certain point. So there wasn't enough content to justify the length, but there is a good story buried in here, and it was interesting learning about this subculture. You know, I'm not the biggest metal fan, but I was kind of curious about listening to the genre a little bit more after reading about it so much. So this was a very bizarre read, but worth checking out. The last book I read is a cute comic collection called Harka, Vagrant by Kate Beaton, who I learned is a Canadian comics artist. This collection is just really fun and entertaining to flip through. Most of the comics are pretty short. They usually are around 3 to 6 panels in length, so they're just kind of fun to flip through. Kate Beaton is interested in history and literature, so they're pretty nerdy and intellectual, but also very silly and ridiculous at the same time, so it struck a really nice balance with me. My favorite was a series where she took these book covers designed by the same artist and then tried to guess in 3 panels what the book would be about based on its cover, but not having read the book. If you enjoy cute, witty little comics, you should definitely check this one out. I thought it was hilarious. So those are all of the books that I read this May. Your takeaway from this video should be to go and check out the Overstory by Richard Powers. Seriously, guys, this is such a great book. It is so beautiful, so emotional, so well crafted. It is just wonderful. So don't let a 500-page book about trees put you off. This is just a magical read, and I would really encourage you to look into this one. I'd love to further the conversation in the comment section, so let me know if you have any thoughts about any of these books. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.